morning, good afternoon, good evening. We are so happy that you are joining us for this Data for Nutrition webinar to hear about National Information Platforms for Nutrition NIPN Contribution Study. This webinar will present the key conclusions from the study and will discuss recommendations to improve the NIPN implementation at country and global levels. The learning from this study can be useful beyond the NIPN community to any actors working on strengthening evidence-based nutrition policies and programs. Next. Just before we start, I would like to share some logistics. Interpretation is enabled for this call. On your Zoom tab, kindly check and click on interpretation or the three dots for more information and click on interpretation. A number of language options will pop up. Select the most preferred language and mute the original one. Next. Microphones and videos are disabled during the presentations. Use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to chat with other participants or contact me, Sharmin Sultana. We encourage you to share your questions with the speakers using the Q&A function. So not the chat, but the Q&A function outlined in blue on the screen. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. If possible, please include the name of the speaker to whom you are addressing your questions. Answer to all the questions and copies of the presentations will be shared on the community's event page in the week after the webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be immediately available on the Data for Nutrition YouTube channel. Next. Today's webinar is hosted by Data for Nutrition Community of Practice. DFN provides members with opportunities to share knowledge, experience, and questions relevant to strengthening the nutrition data value chain at all levels for the purpose of achieving better nutritional outcomes in low and middle income countries. If you are interested in sponsoring a featured webinar, we'd love to hear from you. Now join me to welcome today's moderator, Barbara Bailey. She is a nutrition advisor for the Capacity for Nutrition, NIPN Global Coordination. Welcome, Barbara. We look forward to the webinar.
Thank you, Charming. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be moderating this webinar today. Let's review together first the agenda. If you can go next slide. So we'll have 1 hour together. I'm not seeing the next slide. Yes, thank you. We'll have 1 hour total together. We will hear from 2 experts who conducted the evaluation, and then we'll have a Q&A sessions. So yes, I'm very happy to be moderating today this webinar because this is an important milestone to what have been a 2-year journey. 2 years ago, at the Global Coordination Team for the NIPN project, the National Information Platform for Nutrition project, we started the process to conduct an evaluation of the phase 1 of the NIPN project. We consulted with experts to look for a good approach to evaluate such a complex project. And we concluded that what was needed was a contribution study to look at what NIPN contributed to change and create in countries, as opposed, for instance, at looking at what can be directly attributed to NIPN, which would have been very complex, looking at the nature of the NIPN project. We were very lucky that the N4D group submitted a proposal to conduct the study, and I will now introduce you to the 2 experts who led this contribution study. If you can go next slide. So Carmel and Jeremy are both co-director and co-founder of N4D. If you want to maybe open your camera while I'm listening, listing your bio, Carmel and Jeremy, that would be very nice for the audience. So Carmel is a nutritionist with over 40 years of experience in humanitarian and development settings. She has worked 7 years in Tanzania with DFID and FCDO, I mean, new name. She has worked across Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. She has worked as well within UN and international NGO systems and was a global cluster coordinator for some time. Jeremy Shohan is also a nutritionist with over 40 years of experience in Africa and Asia, working in both humanitarian and development settings. He is a senior lecturer at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a nutrition master for 7 years. And he has worked for multiple UN, international NGOs and donor agencies on evaluation and research programs. He is also the founder and director of the Emergency Nutrition Network, ENN. So, yes, nice to see you, Carmel and Jeremy. Before I give you the floor and then we can listen to the results of the study, maybe you can go next slide and I can briefly give to the audience an introduction to what is NIPN. So that you will better understand what Jeremy and Carmel will drive us through. So National Information Platforms on Nutrition was first developed in 2015 to support the SUN countries that have committed to delivering evidence-based programs and interventions to improve human nutrition in their progress towards the SDG number 2. The observation was that more can be done with existing data, but we need to create demand for information and evidence among policymakers. NIPN objective is to strengthen national capacities for evidence-based nutrition policies and programs. And NIPN work around core principles that are as follows. NIPN is country-owned. NIPN is country-driven, responding to country demands. NIPN analyzes existing data from multi-sectoral sources for national and subnational level analysis. And NIPN communicates clear and actionable messages in a timely manner to influence policymakers. So on the right side of the slide, you have the NIPN operational cycle. I'm not going through it in detail, but this gives you an idea of how NIPN operates. Next slide. The setting of the setup of the NIPN project is displayed on this slide. So my team, CIFRN NIPN, so Capacity for Nutrition, is responsible for the global coordination of the NIPN and is being implemented by the GIZ, the German Cooperation. From phase 1 of the project, this is on the left side of the slide, from 2015 to 2021, NIPN was implemented in 9 countries and supported by the EU, FCDO, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The 9 countries are listing here. On the right side of the slide, you see the setup for the phase 2, which started roughly in 2021, depending on countries. As of 2021, the supporting donors are the EU, the BMZ, and the UNICEF. And the main change from the list of countries is that Bangladesh was closed in February 2022, and Zambia joined the NIPN community starting from last year. So the results from the contribution study that you will listen in a few seconds are based on the phase 1 of the project, meaning the 9 countries listed on the left side of the slide. So I hope this was clear enough and slow enough for the interpreters. And I'm now pleased to give the floor to Carmel and Jeremy for the results of the contribution study. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara, for that warm welcome. Thank you to Datadent for hosting this webinar and for this opportunity to present the study findings. Good afternoon to everybody who has joined the webinar. Next slide. Yes, if you could keep pressing to the end of all those points. I want, first of all, just to do a very quick overview of how we approached this work. We, as Barbara said, focused on phase 1, and we were looking at phase 1 against OECD DAC criteria. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those in a moment. The study approach required us to look back at NIPN in its first phase and since inception. It also requires us to look at countries already transitioning into their second phase and to think forward and consider the future of NIPN and the recommendations that we were being asked to consider. We were very fortunate to spend time doing deep dive visits in Kenya and Niger. And also we spent time in Bangladesh, which was a NIPN country that closed early. We were very keen to learn some lessons from some of the obstacles that Bangladesh confronted. And of course, as is typical when you're carrying out a very detailed study of this type, there was an enormous amount of document review across all the 9 NIPN countries, which was captured in a pre-prepared results framework. Next slide, please. Now, don't worry about all the boxes and words in this, but one of the things we did when we started in the inception period of this work was to revisit and revise the NIPN global theory of change. The reason being was that we needed to get to a better differentiation between the direct outcomes. So if you look to the right of this theory of change and the boxes in that red circle, we wanted to separate out for evaluative purposes the direct outcomes or direct results for which NIPN is accountable, and contrast those through our study with the indirect outcomes, which are those that NIPN contributes to through engagement and partnership with other partners. Now, all of the NIPN countries are working towards a host of indirect outcomes and a common impact, which is improving overall country nutrition outcomes. Many of you on this webinar will fully understand it is not possible for NIPN to directly influence those outcomes, but to contribute to them. Next slide, please. We were very fortunate to have incredibly good stakeholder engagement in the study. We interviewed just over 100 experts from different walks of life, predominantly the NIPN teams within the different NIPN countries, as well as a host of global data-related actors and policy actors as well. And so our net was cast fairly widely, utilizing a pre-structured questionnaire. Now, some of you on this webinar may well have participated as a stakeholder, for which we thank you again. Next slide, please. I mentioned at the beginning that we utilize the OECD DAC criteria, not all the criteria, but just very briefly to recap on what these are. We focused on the relevance of NIPN, particularly asking ourselves a fundamental question: how relevant is NIPN in driving policy and program approaches? Is it relevant? Is it doing a good enough job? Secondly, coherence. This was centrally about the extent to which NIPN collaborates and coordinates at the country level and globally with other initiatives and actors in the data and policy and nutrition space. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, with reference to the theory of change that we revised, we looked at effectiveness And by that, we mean the degree to which NIPN achieved its intended results or the direct outcomes. We also looked for any evidence of impact in terms of the extent to which NIPN could say it was contributing to those indirect outcomes. And finally, you won't be surprised, we focused also on sustainability. So we looked at the different models and approaches and thinking to sustaining NIPN across the different countries and engaged in a number of conversations about those. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Jeremy, who sat next to me here, and he is going to give you some of the headlines based on each of these 5 OECD DAC criteria. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Carmel, and you'll be hearing from Carmel later when she wraps up with conclusions and recommendations. So under relevance, well, I think we have to remember that NIPN came about at a time when people were calling for a data revolution, were calling for better data to inform policy making. During the early stages, NIPN changed quite a bit from its original focus on generating better data to one where its focus was on using existing data to better inform decision making, providing strong evidence which decision makers could confidently use. In phase 1 of NIPN, there was an awful lot of work that had to take place to embed NIPN in the institutions which were going to implement NIPN. So this meant that NIPN couldn't be so outward looking, it had to be inward looking at first. And I think this had a short-term impact on its relevance. But that changed very quickly. I think it's also important to note that in the 9 countries that NIPN was involved in, or beginning to set up its programs, there was a huge range of experiences which shouldn't be underestimated. And we had to take this into account in making a determination about the relevance of NIPN. Having said that, the bottom line is that in our view, NIPN remained relevant at policy and program level and has been very responsive to changing contexts and changing country needs. Next slide, please. The second DAC criteria is coherence. Now here, we first of all thought about the extent to which NIPN came about, largely because of the Sun movement, but hasn't really strategically interacted with Sun systems and more recently, the devolved Sun hubs. That is changing though in the mindset of country NIPN actors. I think it's also fair to say that opportunities to communicate and engage with other data-related initiatives were not fully exploited in phase 1. So for example, humanitarian data systems or the DHIS. But this again has been changing in phase 2. It's also important to remember that NIPN has embedded itself in a way that it has access to sector data through ministries and their sector information systems. And this has allowed NIPN to capture data across a large number of sectors. And that would not have been possible without giving consideration to the best place for NIPN to locate itself institutionally. A huge amount has been achieved in terms of collating and hosting nutrition data sets or national data sets, but there are gaps that remain. And particularly in countries where there is less than full access to sector data, that's a challenge. Next slide, please. So effectiveness, this is really where, as Carmel said, we're interested in results that NIPN could be held directly accountable for results that NIPN could achieve. And we looked at both the data platforms, we looked at the capacity building across sectors to collect nutrition-related data, we looked at effective partnerships with other actors, and we looked, very importantly, at enhanced political commitment to strengthen the use of data. And what we found was that NIPN had managed to create a strong national ownership, which of the NIPN platform and the NIPN program, and that this will be a huge driver of sustainability going forward. We also found that sector capacity building was a huge investment of NIPN in phase 1 and 2. And this has allowed sectors to develop better understanding of what are nutrition sensitive in programs and also the way to monitor and evaluate those programs. Having said that, staff turnover has been a challenge to sustain capacity built. The policy briefs that NIPN has produced have been a significant success, and there's been a very large output across all the countries involving the policy question cycle and development of evidence policy briefs. And we're also seeing that the evidence in these briefs is beginning to be used by decision makers. And finally, under effectiveness, the NIPN dashboards and data repositories, which do vary very much across country. And although there has been no evaluation of these dashboards as yet, some countries, in our view, were particularly imaginative and innovative in the way that these dashboards have been constructed. If we then move on to the next slide, please, which is on impact. So this deals with indirect outcomes. In other words, the ones that NIPN can only contribute to rather than be responsible for. So partnerships are critical to impact. We found that even though many countries got off to a slow start, which was also interrupted by COVID, there are very encouraging examples of NIPN creating or contributing to indirect outcomes or impact. First of all, in a number of countries, NIPN is now largely responsible for monitoring and evaluating the multi-sector nutrition action plans, particularly in countries like Niger, Ethiopia, and Kenya. NIPN is also allowing people to track nutrition progress in countries in a very visible way, sometimes through reanalysis of national survey data. Data is also being used to inform generation of new plans and policies, although the policy cycle can be between 5 and 10 years. So in some countries, it's too early to say there has been a definite impact. And finally, NIPN has helped to move key national policy agenda items forward, like, as Carmel said, the humanitarian development peace nexus, investment in climate risk reduction, and the need to address inequity in nutrition outcomes. Next slide, please, final slide. And this is on sustainability. Now, we looked at this question through 3 lenses: technical, financial, and institutional. And in phase 2, I think it's fair to say that all NIPN programs are beginning to focus more and more as there is uncertainty about their funding going into a phase 3. As far as technical sustainability is concerned, we feel that this is achieved greatly through capacity strengthening across the sectors, as well as within the NIPN team, and that the devolution of NIPN to subnational level to subnational project staff is also contributing to enormous capacity building. There has also been efforts to strengthen the capacity of decision makers, politicians, to understand and utilize nutrition-related data. All this has taken place. Financial sustainability. Well, as I said, phase 2 funding in some countries is beginning to worry NIPN actors. And in phase 2, actually, there was a change in the funding mechanism for some countries, with intermediate organizations like UNICEF holding the funds. And we feel that inadvertently, this had a negative impact on sustainability as it diluted the ownership or the sense of ownership. That was only in a few countries, though. I think most NIPN staff now believe that transition funding will still be needed to move to a sustainable nutrition program. However, having said that, countries are taking contingency measures, which include discussions with other donors, ensuring that a proportion of NIPN activities are carried out by government-funded staff rather than project-funded staff. There's also in-kind support from government for NIPN costs, such as offices and vehicles. And finally, institutional sustainability. Well, the institutional ownership is so important in NIPN. In my mind, it's probably the most important thing. Embedding NIPN in central statistic offices or regional health organizations as part of the Ministry of Health, or even higher level government departments like in Niger, is critical to institutional sustainability. NIPN have also done their very best to ensure that they are in a position where government cannot do without them, because they, for example, monitor the multi-sector nutrition action plan. And then, of course, the devolution is also going to make NIPN irreplaceable as regional, subnational NIPNs develop expertise and provide data for decision makers. So overall, we're optimistic that NIPN will be sustained in countries, even without external funding, but there may need to be some tough choices going forward. And I'll hand you back to Carmel now for conclusions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to try and tell you about all the conclusions and recommendations that N4D made, because it would take too long. But I would encourage you to take a look at the report for those that are very interested in this whole subject area. But I've just picked out a few, and some of them echo some of the information you've just heard from Jeremy. But we are very strongly of the mind that NIPN couldn't be more relevant today than it was when it was first conceived back in the early days of the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. To our mind, it is an exemplary development partner program in the sense that it has done so much, as Jeremy just recapped, to find a level of embeddedness and government ownership of the processes, the systems, in many countries, the financing and the outputs and engagement. And that is, as Jeremy said, extremely important and a very positive way forward when we're thinking about more and better data for nutrition. We need to make sure that is driven by the very institutions in countries that have a mandate and authority around multi-sectoral data. And of course, as Jeremy said, there is work going on around sustainability, and this embeddedness will be a key feature of supporting that. Having said all this, we were of the impression that NIPN warrants more ambition. Now, in the early days of the Sun movement, the idea was to scale up NIPN in tandem with the number of countries joining the movement. Now, it has done incredibly well to embed in 9 countries, but when you think that there are 60 plus countries within the Sun movement alone at the moment, there's a lot of work to be done, but the ambition is warranted. So we want to see more NIPN in other countries. And I'm going to touch on something in a moment around recommendations that might help us think about how that can be enabled. But I want to also emphasize that NIPN is complex, and I think Barbara alluded to that when she shared those early slides with you. It requires an enormous amount of capacitating to truly embed this technical know-how around what data to harness, how to harness it, how to clean it, how to organize data, how to analyze data. On the one hand, that's all the real technical stuff, and on the other, the capacitating that's required to get policy engagement. So it's an enormous investment, and it's enormously valuable at the same time to invest that level of capacity building. It's in many ways one of the standout features of NIPN, the marrying of data with policy and decision making. You don't often see those two communities, if you like, at a national level naturally coming together. And this is what NIPN has brought about. The other thing that we concluded is NIPN has been able to strengthen the monitoring of key indicators for what many people would refer to as the nutrition sensitive sectors. Now, that is incredibly important because along with the work that's slowly going on, increasingly going on in a number of NIPN countries, to also provide regular monitoring of multi-sector nutrition action plan indicators. These are key and invaluable elements of the NIPN approach. If we think back to the early, and even in some countries today, Sun movement, that was really a key missing ingredient, was having good data in order to say, well, how are the different sectors doing, and are we tracking the indicators that we have set aside to show us and make us accountable for the implementation of multi-sector plans. But as Jeremy said, beyond that, when we think about policy, it's a little bit early to say whether or not we should expect a lot of policy impact at this stage. But the mood music is very good because there are signs that that is emerging. So a few of the recommendations we made. Firstly, although progress has been made since we looked at NIPN, had the privilege to look at NIPN, C4N NIPN's work with the Sun Movement Secretariat, the newly formed Sun regional hubs, and the all-important Convergence Hub, which deals with contexts of fragility, cannot be overemphasized. We strongly recommend that global coordination and collaboration is given great prominence, and indeed at the country level through the different Sun focal points and the networks. That is happening. I mentioned a little bit earlier about being more ambitious around NIPN. And one thing that C4N NIPN have been working on is this light approach to shorten elements of the introduction and evolution of NIPN in a country. And one area, for example, that could be shortened, and some countries have already achieved that, is time spent on the policy cycle analysis. So we'd like to see the light approach helping to support the ambition to get NIPN into more countries that have high burdens of malnutrition and need to know where they should be prioritizing and making decisions. We feel that there are some countries that have made more progress quickly than others, inevitably. And those countries should be part of the peer support system to the countries coming on board, the sort of more early startup countries, through peer support visits. That could be incredibly valuable because they really have learned by doing, and they have faced many, many obstacles along the way. We also recommend that NIPN occupies a more central role in supporting the strengthening of the nexus in fragile contexts. NIPN is already in some fragile contexts, and with the work that could go on with the Convergence Hub within the movement, it could help strengthen the use of data between the humanitarian development, peace, and increasingly climate actors and initiative. And some of that thinking is already beginning to emerge in one or two NIPN countries. We fully support that. As Jeremy mentioned, some countries and many of the NIPN countries are looking to devolve NIPN to the subnational level. They're going to be doing that incrementally, often through pilots. we would like to see the very active capture of learning from that and the sharing of that learning across countries, because it is not going to be easy. And it is as interesting to capture what hasn't worked as it is what does work. So we strongly encourage that. And finally, one thing we really felt quite strongly about is that NIPN wasn't doing a very good job of selling its story and telling the story better, both at the national level and even globally. I wouldn't say that's the case today so much at the global level, but one way we felt that they could do that is to develop country-specific theories of change, to tell their own story better, to get more visibility around NIPN at country level, and to support efforts towards its sustainability. Now, since we made that recommendation, N4D has been involved with helping to develop the theories of change for Ethiopia. We're about to do it through workshops for Niger, and there will be a third country fairly soon. But it's very important that countries, because they are all so diverse, and no NIPN country is the same as the other, even though they're working with similar guidance and tools, inevitably their context alters the shape of NIPN in their country. That is the story that needs to be told and captured through really well thought through theories of change. So that is our presentation for you. I hope it's been interesting. And it just leaves me to thank you all for listening and to hand back to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Carmel and Jeremy, and thank you for making it on time. Now we have a few minutes for questions and answers. There is already one question in the chat that I will ask you in a few seconds, just before I want to invite people to raise their hand or type their question in the chat, so we can answer most of the questions. So one question is from an anonymous attendee who says that a global effort will empower local partners to influence decision makers for effective policies and strategies, especially for the most vulnerable. What technical opportunities and resources are needed to build local partners? What do you think, Carmel or Jeremy? Who wants to take this one?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. It's an anonymous attendee, so well done you for putting forward that question. In many ways, I think what you're asking here is really what we've been trying to get across and describe in terms of what NIPN has been done. It is a global initiative, which is all about empowering local, and by local we include national partners, to harness what they have, to use existing multi-sector data and information and bring that together and harness it for the benefit of policy making and decision making. And of course, as I showed in the theory of change slide, this is all about NIPN is contributing to, along with a host of other initiatives that you see, both nationally driven and through international and development partner driven programs tackling high burdens of malnutrition. So what NIPN did in terms of technical opportunities and resources was invest considerably, particularly in phase 1, to getting that off the ground. And, you know, I'm not going to share necessarily the budget details of that, although I do think they're in the report that we wrote. But both those technical resources, there was a lot of guidelines, a lot of human technical assistance going on, and a lot of updating of resources to enable local actors to really take on this program and embed it and own it and utilize it for the benefit of their people. I don't know if Jeremy has anything to add.
I think you covered the main points. One thought that occurred to me was actually from the experience in Niger, where NIPN are actually running a one-year university course, which, based on their 4 or 5 years work around nutrition indicators for nutrition sensitive programming and how they built capacity of sector staff to do that more effectively. So those courses now at university are frequented by international and local civil society organizations. So that kind of thing I think is important, but it also strikes me that some civil society organizations struggle to move away in fragile contexts from being caught in this kind of cycle of humanitarian programming and want to move towards longer term development type work. And I think NIPN has resources which can support that desire. I think NIPN going forward will also help civil societies develop their approach to nexus strengthening and combining humanitarian and development work. So, civil societies are an important stakeholder for NIPN and vice versa.
Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you both. We have one remark from Vailon, our colleague from UNICEF Laos supporting NIPN, who says that to focus, who stresses the importance of strengthening collaboration with routine data system, not only one effort to influence the sustainability of the NIPN, but at the same time to contribute to the strength of the routine data system. And he says that in Laos, we see this importance and they are in the process of starting this collaboration, or I would say to continuing this collaboration at central and subnational level. So just an important remark from Vailon. Maybe you want to react to this, to how important are routine data systems as well.
Yes, well, I think there are a number of countries where NIPN is looking at that increasingly. So not just working with surveys. So in Kenya, they're looking at clinic data and trying to assess the strength of clinic data, both in terms of its seasonal, what it shows seasonally, and when there's a shock of some kind. In Ethiopia as well, they're increasingly looking at that, partly because the national surveys only happen every 5 years or so, and those data come out of date. So ongoing data collection is really important, and NIPN are certainly turning their attention to it.
Thank you. There is one additional question from Julien, who is asking for concrete examples examples, plural, on how NIPN could coordinate better with humanitarian information systems. You mentioned the Nexus as a recommendation of your study. Yeah, can you give us some examples on how we can coordinate better with the humanitarian system? Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't think there's some kind of magical answer for that, because up till now, partly because of where NIPN came from, NIPN hasn't really coordinated well with humanitarian systems. I think that's beginning to change in both Niger, Kenya, and Ethiopia, all three countries. And really, it's just a question of reaching out to stakeholders and getting them interested. It's a question of asking for their data to be shared, because in some contexts, the humanitarian data, the SMART surveys, for example, are critical. That's true in Kenya. It's also true in parts of Ethiopia. So I don't think we can give you a great example of where coordination has been super effective yet, but it is something NIPN is increasingly giving its attention to.
Yes, and if I could add, Julien, it will be probably something that we discuss when we're running the Niger workshop on their country-specific theory of change, because as Jeremy said, in these fragile contexts, we can't afford not to be harnessing existing data that's being driven from the humanitarian sector. And that, Jeremy mentioned smart data, but there's other data. You know, when you think about fragility, you can be thinking about climate data, and you can be actually probably thinking about seeing what the peace actors where you're working with conflict fragility, which is ever increasing, unfortunately, globally. So yes, there's nutrition data, but there's also information across the so-called humanitarian space that is very useful to find its way onto the NIPN database and platform to inform wider analysis, trend analysis, understanding, for example, you know, why you might get persistently high levels of wasting in some contexts, which definitely exists, and being able to get beneath data through use of diverse sources that a lot of humanitarian actors capture.
When we were in Niger last year doing the deep dive country study for Niger, the NIPN team were only just beginning to engage with humanitarian actors. So that was halfway through phase 2. So it's not something that's really happened up until now.
No.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. You want to add something, Carmen?
No.
Okay, sorry. There is an additional question in that same line, which is from Hailu Gebeza, saying that maybe NIPN platform can be used as a data source and M&E system for the HDP nexus in the country. And I think this is also in line with what you just said, and this is also what countries like Niger are trying to do. Maybe I can go through another kind of questions, which is from the EU delegation in Niger. So we stay a bit in Niger. Tarsis is making a comment more than a question, saying that the institutional ownership is already there, but there is still an issue of developing a sustainable financial approach. What can you, how do you react to this comment?
Barbara, can you repeat that question?
Sorry, it's Tarsis says that the institutional ownership in Niger, for instance, is already there, but there is still an issue of developing a sustainable financial approach for NIPN.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I think most countries now have a sustainability, NIPN have sustainability plans, and they're constantly being updated. I guess we shouldn't really get too much into the detail, and we're not party to all the information and discussions that are ongoing. But there is uncertainty about whether phase 3 will be, whether a phase 3 will be financed, funded by its current donors. So countries inevitably are looking to see what they can do to mitigate any shortfall of funding that may occur. And I tried to show that in the slides. I think that it's a multifaceted approach which countries are taking. It's about becoming so important and useful to government that government want to continue funding and financing NIPN to the extent that it can. It's about ensuring that current government staff who are salaried have the capacity to implement NIPN should project staff no longer be funded. There's a range of approaches which countries are exploring, and there's no magic bullet. But having said that, in our view, it would be almost criminal if phase 3 funding was not to occur and NIPN started to disappear. It would just follow that long line of development projects which have been great when they've been funded externally but haven't been sustained. And NIPN, more than any project Carmel and I have seen for a long time, deserves merits being sustained and growing.
Yes, and that echoes the point I made about being more ambitious and telling the story better. I do think that within countries, now that they've got beyond the kind of early phase 1 of goodness, how do we do this, to being a much more well-oiled machine in terms of what they have to do, what they are doing, and they're engaging further. They've got to spend a lot more time on comms and advocacy. The theory of change thinking is that that can be part of that storytelling. So in a very clear way, you sit and you present to potential funders. And I mean, I'm not just talking about international donors here, but they also have a responsibility, I think, for NIPN. It's also, Treasury through the different national institutions. They need to be telling a more powerful story of what they are doing, but the ambitions. And someone posted a question further up the chat: can NIPN be the one-stop shop for all nutrition data? Absolutely, it can be and should be. Now, we don't need to see NIPN being reinvented when we come sit down at the next global gathering for the Sun Movement and say, oh dear, we need more and better data for nutrition. This is what NIPN is all about. So it's incumbent on everybody, both at the national level, now within the regions, and not just the Sun regional networks, but also other regional entities, and globally, global donors, global actors like C4N, NIPN, and others, to get behind it and really start telling the story more clearly. Because as Jeremy said, why wouldn't you want to sustain an initiative like NIPN? Because we absolutely need to be tracking various indicators. There's a whole accountability element to that, and needs to be feeding up into the Nutrition for Growth, nutrition accountability framework on a routine basis, and it needs financing and sustaining. Now, it has only gone to 9 countries, and as I mentioned earlier, there are many more. Now, I don't know what C4N NIPN are thinking around getting to more scale, let's say, with the NIPN program, because that, of course, will also be dependent on how powerfully at the global level that story can be told to drive up more funding. But yes, that visibility and advocacy and communication is absolutely vital. But we need to see more match funding with national authorities, and that's beginning to happen. You see in some countries the key staff sitting in bureaus of statistics and within the policy arm of government are being made more permanent. Units in one country, unit is being created. I think in others that may well be happening as well. These are all good signs, but it doesn't necessarily amount to a real confidence around the sustainability of NIPN. And that is absolutely in phase 2 what all the attention also needs to go to. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Carmel. I think that we have 1 minute for an additional question, which is more a reflection. It's Shadiq Akbar in Bangladesh, pointing out the fact that we don't see much of local organizations, institutions, local NGOs being involved in, for instance, the Sun focal groups in Bangladesh. All partners are international NGOs or development partners. So can you reflect a bit on how we could have more engagement, more involvement from local institutions, local NGOs as drivers for NIPN?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a very honest question. Because
but you have 1 minute only.
1 minute, because, thank you, Barbara, because it is a problem. But all I can say in the 1 minute and counting down is the approach that NIPN took, which was, okay, yes, admittedly, it was a development partner, and by that I mean at the global level, initiative in order to track progress against stunting, actually, in the early days, global targets for stunting. What NIPN is now is very, very different to that, in the sense that it has ensured national and local ownership, and that is the only way that can be done. But I do agree that it is a constant battle in countries to localize development programs. We talk about localization in the humanitarian space because we're making so little progress with localization. That's the truth. But it's also a key issue in the development space as well. And it's incumbent on governments, on donors, on other international actors to walk the talk and get serious about localization and national ownership so that it is more inclusive and engages the very brilliant local organizations that often exist across countries. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Carmel. Thank you, Jeremy. And with this, I give back the floor to Charmaine to close the webinar.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Barbara, Bailey, and our speaker, Carmel Dolan, and Jeremy Soham for a great discussion and presentations. A recording of this webinar will be available on Data for Nutrition YouTube channel, and copies of the presentation and summary of the Q&A will be shared on the webinar page in the coming weeks. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you very much.